Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Blade Runner 2, The Edge of Human, by K.W. Jeter. Chapter 15. I'll need transportation. Deckard tilted his head toward the vehicle they'd left on the Tyrell Corporation's landing deck. Your spinner will do. All right. Sarah gave him a knowledgeable smile. After all, you can't just go walking around on the streets, can you? As we've learned. He turned away from the view of the city's lights, spread out below the headquarters complex. You're the one who put me out there. You knew that was what that Isidore person would do. He studied her reaction. I can't figure out why you'd want that to happen. Her smile deepened. Let's just say that we both learned something that we might not have otherwise. You survived, didn't you? So now I can be certain that finding our missing replicant won't be beyond you. Sarah's manner became brusque. Businesslike. Go ahead and take the spinner. I figured you'd need it, so I had it prepared for you. Don't try to leave to get out of the city. That wouldn't be advisable. The spinner has a perimeter choke, a circle with its center here. She didn't need to make a gesture. Deckard knew she meant the Tyrell Corporation headquarters itself. Try going farther, and you'll get a red warning light on the instrument panel. Keep going, and you'll fall from the sky in little flaming pieces. It had been pretty much what he'd expected. Why should she trust him? A small, irrational hope flicked off inside him. If the spinner had had no spatial limit, he would have hot-footed it straight north to Rachael, sleeping and dying and waiting for him. Screw L.A. and Sarah Tyrell and any missing sixth replicant. Don't worry, said Deckard. I'll return all your company property to you in good shape. Except for the sixth replicant. It might be a little beat up when I dump it at your feet. Really? She raised an eyebrow. I'm glad to see you showing such enthusiasm for your job. Sarah turned away and began walking toward the elevator that would carry her down into the corporation's bowels. She stopped and glanced over her shoulder. I'll be waiting. I had you coded through the security systems, so you can come straight in when you're ready. He called after her. Is that it? I thought you wanted to talk about something. Please. She pressed the control, and the silvery doors parted. Let me have a few pretenses, Deckard. I just wanted to see you. That's all. Sarah stepped inside the elevator and with the palm of her hand kept its doors from closing. You were on my mind. Perhaps I just wanted to find out if I were on yours. She pulled her hand away. The doors slid shut, and she was gone. A moment later, Deckard traversed the night sky, the bright pin-prick carpet of the city's lights rolling below him. To either side, police spinners shot by on their own errands, either not picking him up on their radars or getting a VIP readout on their computer screens high enough to keep them sailing past. The city's towers were well behind him. Deckard looked out the side of the spinner's cockpit and down and saw darkness, more complete than the cloud-mottled sky. The sideways world, with its fallen buildings and edge-tipped empty freeway seemed to be within the spinner's circle. That made it easier. He still needed some place where he could pull his act together, think everything through, as he'd been doing before Sarah Tyrell had shown up and spirited him away for no good reason other than to lay the spinner on him. Off in the distance, a red glow shone, a flickering apparition. Somewhere else in the zone, a fire apparently had broken out. Just beyond the knife blade of steel and concrete that ran a diagonal through the sideways world was the familiar aspect of the safe house apartment's toppled building. He brought the spinner down low, hovering, and then descending vertical into the small, cleared space beside it. Once he'd gotten out, boots crunching into the cement fragments and bits of rusted metal that constituted the zone's surface layer, he activated all the spinner's security devices, sealing the cockpit down tight. Parts scavengers were always active at this dark hour, along with randomly motivated vandal types. He didn't want to come back out here and find his transportation stripped. He pocketed the small remote that Sarah had given him and headed into the unlit apartment building. The safe house apartment still smelled like death, an odor that connected with receptors off the olfactory net. A reverse C page into the walls, like electrical service shut off for failure to pay the bill. That was more or less what had happened to Pris, not even retired. That bad faith euphemism, but forcibly unplugged. All the batteries removed, or a new one put in the socket above her eyes. A cold, shiny one that sucked up pseudo-life rather than bestowing it. That image weighed on Deckard's thoughts. It made him feel as if he'd spent his whole Blade Runner career as more of a sinister electrician than anything else. Former Blade Runner, he reminded himself as he straightened back up after ducking beneath the apartment's front doorway. That hadn't changed, despite his having been recruited for one more job. He reached behind himself and lifted the door closed. The resistance to becoming a murderer again was even more final than when Bryant had put the pressure on him. Plus, there wasn't a big open-ended prospect ahead of searching and killing and searching and killing until he'd gone through the whole list of escaped replicants. There was only the one to deal with. And I already know, thought Deckard, standing still to let his eyes adjust to the darkness, who it is. He stepped through the apartment, hand outstretched to find any of the generator-powered lights. That little geek Sebastian and his friends had moved everything around. Deckard supposed they had as much right to do it as anyone. He halted as the sound of something beside his own breathing and stumbling progress hit his ears. "You make this too easy," he recognized the voice. It hadn't been that long ago, but had no chance to reply. Another sound, that of something hard and narrow, whipping through the air. He doubled over in pain when the object hit him in the gut. Another poke knocked him off his feet. The lights came on. He found himself, as he gasped for breath, looking up at Dave Holden, standing above him, the leg from the kitchen table in his hands. "God damn it," Deckard managed to squeeze the words out. "What the hell was that for?" "That was for jerking me around for so long." Holden put the end of the table leg against Deckard's shoulder, pinning him back down to the wall beneath. "Not just the last time I was out here talking to you, but all the times before as well." He jabbed the table leg harder. "You must have been laughing your ass off when I walked out of here before." Getting onto his knees, Deckard knocked the table leg away with the back of his hand. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Oh, you will. Taking a step backward, Holden called out over his shoulder. Hey, come on out here. I've had my fun. He brought his smug gaze around to Deckard. This is going to trip you out, buddy. A real blast from your past. As he stood up, Deckard could hear someone else emerging from the further sections of the safe house apartment. That could be a problem, dealing with two people. He would have been able to take Holden, with or without the table leg between them. His ex-partner looked as frail as he'd had during their last confrontation, with the biomechanical heart in his chest audibly clicking and laboring to perform its functions. Whoever it was that had come out here with Holden, the person had given him a shot of confidence. Smiling, Holden threw away his crude but minimally effective weapon. Say hello. Holden tilted his head toward the doorway at the other side of the room. I think you know each other, in a way at least. Deckard glanced away from him, in the direction indicated, and felt the world drop out from beneath himself. Jesus Christ! A shock wave of adrenaline pulsed through him, drawing his spine rigid. Deckard's startled brain spun gearless for a moment. Ducking underneath the side of the door, a dead thing stepped through, finishing the zipping up of his fly. Visitors always come around, you know, when you're indisposed. Roy Batty straightened up and flashed his manic smile, eyes bright. Hey, it's good to see you too. No. He took an involuntary step away from the smiling, hands reaching behind himself for balance. You're dead. I know it. I saw it happen. An entire memory reel fast-forwarded through his head. A jumble of water sluicing blood over rusted metal. Then a scruffy white pigeon, a winged city rat, climbing into the sky from hands that had fallen open and would never close upon anything again. You're dead, Batty. Well, yes and no. Batty's image. Deckard wasn't sure yet whether it was real or an hallucination. Gave a judicious shrug. A copy of me is dead. Hell, lots of copies are, but I'm not. The original has proven to be somewhat more durable. That's the truth, Deckard. With his hands free of the table leg, Holden had dug into his jacket pocket and come up with the same gun he'd had before. Or at least I think it is, for the time being. This guy's the templant for all the Roy Batty replicants, including the one you met up with before. The explanation made sense, sort of. Looking closer at the figure standing before him, Deckard could see that the man appeared older than the one that existed in his own memory banks. Both bio and chronologically older. Hands bonier, a little loose flesh around the tendons of his neck. Lines that came with the passage of time set into his face. A Batty replicant would never have reached this stage. The built-in limitation of a 4-year lifespan precluded it. Unless he supposed it was a possibility. Something had been done to prolong its existence past that hard cutoff point. Whether the Roy Batty in the tilted room was human or not, that wasn't something he was worried about now. The shock of again seeing that smiling face had passed. What concerned him was the gun in Holden's hand and the cooperative air between the two men. What's the deal? He looked from one to the other. I have a feeling you didn't come out here just to say hello. That's the truth as well. Holden kept the gun pointed at him. We're taking you in, Deckard. We're going to hand you over at the police station downtown. On what? Administrative charges? If these two didn't know about Pris having been human and his being tagged for her murder, he wasn't going to tell them. He couldn't believe that these two loose cannons were in on the LAPD loop. Maybe they could be bluffed. So I made unauthorized use of a department spinner when I split town. That's not a hanging offense. They can reimburse themselves out of the money I left in the pension plan. Can the bullshit? Holden shook his head in evident disgust. Replicants don't have 401ks. What are you talking about? The two men shared glances and a smile between them, then looked back at Deckard. You're a replicant. You know it, and now we know it. Retirement for you is a whole different sort of thing. Actually, Roy, I'm not entirely sure how we should proceed here. With his free hand, Holden scratched his chin. Why are we bothering to talk with this schmuck? He's a replicant. We've already established that. So why don't we just ice him now? We can drag his dead carcass into the station just as easily. Easier, as a matter of fact. Don't be stupid. Batty looked annoyed. It's not just that he's an escaped replicant here on Earth. He's the only lead we've got on the conspiracy against the Blade Runner unit. If we snuff him before we can shake him down for what he knows, how are we going to find out who was behind setting you up and killing Bryant and all the rest of that stuff? Oh, yeah, right. Holden appeared confused, his gaze wandering to some abstract point near the apartment's uppermost wall. His face and throat had drained white, as though whatever repair work the doctors might have done on him was now beginning to come apart. Wait a minute. We can't even take him into the station until we find out more shit. Even more insisted. Batty's voice prodded the other. We have to find out who in the police is tied up in this. Otherwise, we could be walking into there and handing him right over to the people he's been working with. Then they'd ice our asses. I said, wait. With his trembling, upraised hand, Holden tried to ward off the other's arguments. Deckard looked from one to the other. Geriatrics, he realized, like having been captured by a mobile wing of the nearest old folks' home. You people are completely screwed up. He took a quick couple of steps and picked up the wooden table leg that Holden had tossed aside. Before the other man could react, he turned around and knocked the gun from his hand. The partial impact was enough to send the enfeebled Holden sprawling. The other one was faster. He sensed Batty launching himself from across the room. A split second later, a forearm was against his throat and the man's weight on his back. Locked together, they toppled and crashed into the wall beside the door. A hand brought up by his chin was enough to peel Batty's chokehold away. The lined visage snarled at Deckard as he got his palms against the other's shoulders and pushed him away. Deckard shook his head. You're too old for this nonsense. He raised his knee against Batty's abdomen, prying away the crawling grasp of the withered hands and throwing him on top of Holden's dazed, prostrate form. Fuck you! Batty scrambled toward the gun a few feet away. In an instant, he'd estimated his chances of reaching the gun before the other man or getting it away from him. Deckard turned and dived for the apartment's entranceway, yanking open the door and tumbling out into the unlit hallway just as a bullet ripped out a section of plaster above him. He got to his feet and ran. Shit! Outside the building, he discovered that the pocket of his long coat had been ripped loose in the struggle with Batty. The remote for the spinner's security devices was gone, probably somewhere back inside the safe house apartment. He slammed his fist against the curved glass of the cockpit, but nothing happened. Noises came from the front of the building. He glanced behind himself and saw that both Holden and Batty had emerged. Some kind of scuffle had broken out between the two of them. Deckard could hear them shouting, faces close to each other. As he moved around to the other side of the spinner, he saw Holden grab for the gun in Batty's hand. They wrestled briefly before a shot snapped through the night air. Holden fell against the side of the building, clutching at the bright smear of blood that had erupted through the torn shoulder of his jacket. "Deckard, stop!" he heard Batty shouting as he pushed himself away from the locked spinner, turned and ran. Another shot kicked up a spray of concrete chips and dust at his feet. "Come back here!" "Your ass!" He kept running, picking his way as quickly as possible across the jagged terrain. Fragments of starlight penetrated the clouds overhead, turning the low jumble of broken shapes to tarnished silver. Perhaps he was dying. It was hard to tell. Right now, his head felt as though it were about to explode, not with pain, but with the rush of energy that had welled inside him from the moment he'd stood back up in the safe house apartment. That bastard knocked something loose, thought Holden, as he lay against the wall of the deserted apartment building. One hand clutched to his bleeding shoulder. Some governor mechanism for the clattering heart in his chest had gone awry. His pulse seemed to be racing twice as fast as it ever had before. The wound was more of an annoyance than anything else. Holden managed to get to his feet, swaying a little. But it would serve his ex-partner right if the blow from the table leg and its consequences were what enabled him to catch up and nab Deckard. Beat his head a few times against the stony ground before deciding what to do with him next. If his own heart didn't swell up and burst before then, like an overheated engine flying to pieces with its internal violence. Deckard had taken advantage of him during a temporary moment of weakness, when the biomechanical heart and lungs had been chugging through a low point in their cycles. Now the son of a bitch would have to deal with the old Dave Holden. Better than old, he thought grimly. Bracing himself against the wall for balance, he spotted something on the ground before him. His artificial heart surged when he saw what it was. The gun. He'd gotten it away from Batty, but the other man had twisted it around and squeezed off the single round that had dropped him. Then the son of a bitch must have been in too much of a hurry, chasing after Deckard, to stop and search around here for it. Holden bent down to pick up the gun, and realized his mistake immediately. When his head went below the level of his heart, the amped-up wave of blood dizzied him. To blackout, he fell, fist grasping tight around the gun's handle. On the spinning earth, he could feel the gun sweating against his palm. He managed to lift his head for a moment. The edges of his gaze turned red as he scanned the limits of the angular landscape. Motion against stillness. He'd sighted Deckard even better. He saw that there was no place farther to which the replicant and ex-Blade Runner could get to. Deckard had traversed enough of the rubble-strewn ground to hit smack against the abandoned freeway, turned onto its side by the long-ago earthquakes. A blank wall trisected by lane divider dashes reared up against the night sky, with a human-like figure small against its base. Another figure appeared, running, quickly eating up the distance between Deckard and itself. The shock of white hair was enough to identify Batty. "Don't bother, Deckard! You're not going anywhere!" Batty's gloating call cut through the night air. As Holden watched, vision wavering. The figure in the long coat started climbing, hands clawing at cracks in the freeway's vertical surface, boots scrambling at crumbling projections of cement or ends of metal reinforcement rods. Deckard had already worked himself up to the center lane by the time Batty sprinted across the last few yards. "Don't kill him!" Holden's voice came out as an agonized whisper. "You've got to keep him alive." Gun in hand, he pushed himself up from the ground to his knees. That was his last effort. Holden sprawled forward, seeing nothing, feeling only the cold weight of the gun under his fingertips and the razor-edged stones pressing against his face. Into his eyes fell dust and grit, knocked loose from above by Deckard's progress toward the freeway's upper edge. Batty reached for the next hold and pulled himself up, threads of blood trickling from his abraded fingertips to the tautened cords of his wrist. Against the clouds that had shrouded the night sky, he'd momentarily lost track of Deckard, only when he got his hands onto the top edge, scrambling one knee and then the other up onto the horizontal surface, did he catch sight of him again. As Batty crouched, he spotted Deckard running along the narrow ribbon. The freeway's understructure had broken away during the original quake, leaving a sheer drop into darkness on either side of a meter-wide span. Batty saw a dark space open up before the figure in the long coat. A section of the freeway wall had previously disintegrated, leaving an abrupt cliff front on either side of the gap. Deckard halted, nearly toppling from the crumbling brink. He glanced over his shoulder at Batty, then drew back for a running leap. That hesitation was enough. Batty dived, one outstretched hand grappling Deckard's foot just as it lifted from the edge's flat surface. They fell together, Batty's shoulder hitting the concrete as he crooked his gun arm around Deckard's knee, rolling onto his back. Deckard shoved the butt of his hand against Batty's forehead, pushing him back and toward the edge's limit. From beneath them came snapping and grinding noises. The impact of their bodies was more than the freeway section could withstand. The network of cracks along the vertical surface suddenly widened. Boulders of cement crumbling away from the mesh of rusted metal beneath. Batty felt the gulf open beneath, the dark air made tangible with the gray dust filling his mouth and nostrils. The collapse of the freeway section yanked Deckard's ankle from his grasp. He rolled onto his shoulder, his arm desperately reaching, hand locking on to an angled stub of rebar sticking out from the ragged precipice above him. Twisting his neck, he saw the concrete and interwoven metal tumbling to the ground below with a crescendoing, bass-heavy roar. Batty held on, his other hand reaching up and grasping the freeway's narrow edge. He pulled himself onto it, chest scraping across the rough surface. The collapse of the middle section had peeled with it another layer of the remaining vertical wall, leaving a tight rope-like span only a few inches wide. Kneeling with one hand gripping the edge for balance, he looked across the now wider gap as the dust sifted out of the moon's thin radiance. He could see that Deckard had managed to hold on as well, catching on to the far edge of the gap and scrambling up onto the ribbon of horizontal, empty space falling away to either side. He watched as Deckard got to his feet, one behind the other, arms outstretched to darkness, carefully backing away from the gap, then halting. There was nowhere else for Deckard to go. The section of freeway edge on which he stood was less than 2 meters long, a narrow island rearing up from the rubble and ancient debris below. He looked over his shoulder at the sharp drop behind him, one heel right at the crumbling rim, then back across the unbridgeable gap between him and his pursuer. Another rumbling noise moved through the air. The monsoon clouds gathered so low as to almost press upon Batty's shoulders. He could taste the electricity discharged and crackling in the atmosphere. "Don't go away, Deckard!" A shout, and then a smile that Batty knew would be even more disturbing to the trapped figure opposite. "I'll be right there!" Dragging himself up the side of the crevice, after the vertical wall had given way beneath him, left Deckard grasping for breath. His pulse hammered in his throat as he looked across the breach of empty space, toward the figure on the opposite freeway section. A few drops of rain warmed to the temperature of the blood in his veins, spattered against his face as he watched Batty take a few careful steps backward. "He can't. Impossible." Fragments of thoughts were all that Deckard's brain produced. "It's too far." Batty stripped off his leather jacket and tossed it away. The sparse, hot rain mingled with the sweat on his shoulders and chest. The smile diminished as Batty's gaze narrowed, seeking out and locking onto Deckard's. The face was still ancient, lined and chiseled by time, even as the revealed body seemed to grow larger, the corded and veined muscles swelling with some deep vital influx. The drops of water collected in the hollows beneath Batty's cheekbones, then curved along the angles of his jaw and into his throat as he leaned forward, one hand reaching before him, as though the untremored fingers could grip the humid air itself. Thoughts dissolved to wordless memory flash inside Deckard's skull as he saw Batty running toward him. Another time, another place. In the city's depths, far above its darkly luminous streets. Another vault of empty space carved out of the night by the lashing rain. The past merged without seam into the present as he watched, his own breath lodged fist-like in his throat, as the glistening form, human yet not, sprinted along the concrete ribbon. A last footfall in the crumbling rim, then Batty launched himself across the dark gap. The past moment and the present, and none at all. Time halting with Deckard's pulse. Sudden lightning lit up the heavy undersides of the storm clouds. The blue-white illumination transforming Batty into an angel of steel and diamond, held aloft from the dull earth's gravity by its own fierce internal falling. Deckard shook himself from the image's spell, scrambling backward, one foot misplaced and slipping off the edge. Pebbles of cement pattered down the wall as he caught himself hard on one knee, both hands clutching at the horizontal surface beneath his chest. "Got you!" Batty's voice sounded from above him. At the same moment, the other's hands grabbed the front of Deckard's shirt. Rain oozed from the wadded cloth and ran over the knuckles of Batty's fists as he lifted Deckard from the narrow concrete. He smiled, his bright gaze shining up into Deckard's dazed eyes. "You weren't expecting that." Batty jerked his arms, wrists pressed against each other, his doubled fists knocking Deckard's chin back. "Am I right?" He made no answer, but rammed one knee against Batty's gut, hard enough to break the hold at his throat. Batty staggered backward, arms flailing, catching himself just before the crevice gapping behind him. Deckard twisted as he fell, his spine hitting the edge of the concrete, shoulders leaning back into empty air. Before he could scramble away, Batty was on top of him. "Good job." The words slid through Batty's clenched teeth. "You know, you really are one of the best." His hand gripped tight on Deckard's throat. "I hate to have to kill you." Blindly, Deckard clawed at the concrete edge, pressing into his back. A stone weight fell into his fist. He whipped his arm up in a roundhouse arc, the chunk of cement slamming into the corner of Batty's temple. The blow rocked the other man back, his grip loosening on Deckard's throat. He took one hand away and touched the rain-diluted blood streaming down the side of his face. Batty nodded appreciatively. "That really hurt." Deckard managed to push his shoulder blades a few inches further along the edge. He cradled the cement chunk in his fist, warily eyeing the figure crouching above him. The realization had rushed upon him. You're the sixth replicant." He saw it now. There must have been 2 Roy Batty replicants among the escapees. "Aren't you? You'd have to be." The oozing blood leaked into the corner of Batty's smile. "No," he slowly shook his head. "I don't think I am." "But the way you jumped." Raising his head, Deckard pawed the rain away from his eyes. "It was too far. That was the way he did it. The other Batty. The one that died." He peered closer at the face, the white hair plastered onto its wounded brow. Impossible to tell if the appearance of age had been a shock, something to lull his quarry into complacency, or whether a deep reserve of energy and will had surged up inside Batty, transforming him to some ancient, maddened glory. "So you must be another replicant, just like it was." "No." Another shake of the head. "It's like I told your friend. I'm just very, very good at what I do. That's why I was hired for this job." Batty's smile faded. He turned his head, gaze shifting toward the dark. "Besides, if I were a replicant," his voice grew low and brooding, "that would mean that certain people had lied to me, that they had been lying to me all along, and I wouldn't be at all happy about that." He looked back around at Deckard. One sly corner of the smile reappeared. "It doesn't matter anyway, whether I'm the replicant or you are. I'm still going to kill you. Then I'll turn you in, what's left of you, and get paid." He leaned forward, hand reaching for Deckard's throat. "That's all there is to it." Deckard whipped the cement chunk toward the side of Batty's head. The other blocked it with its forearm, the impact dislodging the stone from Deckard's grasp and sending it clattering down the wall of the abandoned freeway. At the same moment, the sharp ridge beneath them crumbled. Deckard slid a few inches further out into empty space, with Batty's fists locked onto his throat. "Go ahead, Deckard!" Batty had shot a glance down to where Deckard's hands had shoved themselves against the top of the wall. A push from his braced arms would send them both toppling toward the jagged ground below. "Maybe I'll make it." A mad spark flared in Batty's eyes. "But you won't." The other's grinning face wavered behind a haze of red as Deckard's throttled breath swelled to the bursting point in his lungs. He could feel his own hands pushing at the crumbling stone, the tiny stones and grit digging into his flesh. His spine scraped raw across the edge, trapped blood rushing into his skull as he dangled backward. Rain spattered on the roof of his mouth as the night's air suddenly rushed into his lungs. Batty's grip had loosened on his throat. The blinding haze faded. Above him, the fierce intent in the other's eyes had been replaced by uncomprehending wonder. Red seeped through Batty's eyebrows, spidering out from the concave ruin of his shattered forehead. From a black hole, its diameter that of a high-caliber bullet, a finger of blood reached down and gently touched Deckard between his own eyes. The echo of the gunshot was swallowed by the rumbling thunder of the clouds, masking the sky overhead. Batty fell, his body collapsing on top of Deckard, then tumbling, arms outstretched, down the freeway's wall. Deckard scrambled to grab hold of the edge of concrete, to keep from being pulled after the dead thing. Gasping in exhaustion, Deckard crawled full length onto the narrow horizontal space, with his chest and the side of his face flat against the concrete, fingertips dug tighter holes. Sheets of rain lashed across his back. One of the corpse's heels had caught in an angle of rusted steel, leaving it dangling a few feet above the sideways world's rubble-strewn surface. Batty's arms flopped back in an inverted crucifix, the face gaping upward so the rain could sluice the blood from the head wound, pink rivulets thinning upon the ground beneath. Holden lowered the gun, bullet heat seeping from the metal into his hand. The artificial heart staggered in his chest. He drew one cautious breath after another, trying to keep from passing out again. He'd barely been able to make it this far, creeping and stumbling from where he'd fallen, in front of the empty apartment building. He knew he'd almost been too late. It had taken nearly all of his strength to wrap both hands around the gun and lift its crushing tonnage above his head. The rain had pounded into his face as he sucked in his breath, aimed and fired. He heard other noises now. He looked up again and saw Deckard slowly clambering down the cracked and gouged surface of the freeway. With the gun's weight dragging his arm, he hobbled over to where the other man now stood. Looks worse than me, thought Holden. That son of a bitch Batty had really worked him over. Deckard, I heard. Holden gulped air into his wheezing biomechanical lungs. I heard what you said up there. He nodded, his own wet shirt collar rubbing against his neck. You're right. Batty was the sixth replicant. He had to be. It all seemed so clear to him now. That's how he was disguising himself, trying to get away with it, as somebody else hunting down the sixth replicant. A cold gaze came from Deckard's wearied eyes. Maybe, he shrugged, but it's like Batty said, it doesn't matter. Deckard turned and started walking away. Holden grabbed onto his arm. But we still don't know. He held on desperately, both to keep from falling and so that Deckard would have to listen to him. We don't know who was gunning for us, who was trying to get rid of all the Blade Runners. Deckard shook him off. You'll have to worry about all that. I've got other business to take care of. You don't understand. Lungs straining for oxygen. Holden shouted after him. We have to stick together. He heard something behind him, back by the wall of the tilted freeway, as did Deckard. They both turned and looked. A figure, almost human, had crept out of the shadows behind the vertical stone and exposed lacework of metal reinforcement. A thing with darkened eye sockets and a tangled mat of hair, white as that of the dangling corpse. Sinews and skeletal joints poked through the gaping holes of a ragged leotard. The creature's flesh was pallid leather beneath. A rhythmic heartbeats passed before Holden recognized the thing. It's that other replicant, he thought, appalled. The female one. He couldn't remember what its name had been. Blood had seeped into the colorless hair, the dried black spikes melting into red as the monsoon rains tangled sticky tendrils along the thing's neck. It was the one, he knew, that the little geek Sebastian had been in love with, that he'd been able to make move around in a bad parody of living things. Something had happened to it, a wound similar to Batty's. White bone fragments and jellied brain tissue showed through the catastrophic damage to the skull. Dead, but still moving. Holden watched in distaste and dread as some blind instinct drew the once living thing toward the other corpse. Its hand reached up and tremulously stroked the hollowed angles of Batty's jaw. It laid its own ravaged cheek against his, as though the gaping mouth were still capable of bestowing a kiss. Blood and rain mingled together, weeping along the faces of the dead. Holden shuddered as he raised the gun and aimed. He couldn't stand it any longer. Before he could squeeze the trigger, another's hand stayed his, pushing the weapon aside. "Don't," said Deckard. "Just leave them alone." He let the gun dangle at his side as he watched Deckard walk back toward the empty apartment building. The sustaining trickle of adrenaline ebbed from Holden's veins. He sank down upon the ground's wet stones. He breathed and listened to his own erratic heartbeat under the rain's slashing counterpoint.